Our next speaker is Dr. Janet Smylie, who is a family physician and public health researcher. She currently works as a research scientist in Aboriginal health at St. Michael's Hospital Centre for Research on Inner City Health, where she directs the Well Living House Applied Research Centre for Indigenous Infant, Child, and Family Health. Her primary academic appointment is as an associate professor in the Dalalana School of Public Health, University of Toronto. She maintains a part-time clinical practice with Inner City Health Associates at 7th Generation Midwives Toronto. Dr. Smylie has practiced and taught family medicine in a variety of Aboriginal communities, both urban and rural. She is a member of the Métis Nation of Ontario with Métis roots in Saskatchewan. Her research interests are focused in the area of addressing the health inequities that challenge Indigenous infants, children, and their families through applied health service research. Dr. Smylie currently leads multiple research projects in partnership with First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities organizations. Dr. Smylie holds a CIHR Applied Public Health Research Chair in Indigenous Health Knowledge and Information and was honored with the National Aboriginal Achievement Inspire Award in Health in 2012. Welcome, Dr. Smylie.
Here we are. Thank you very much and good morning. I want to acknowledge Elder and Knowledge Keeper Dorothy Larkman, who I think may be sitting in the back. Did she open us up this morning before I came? And I also want to acknowledge the rain and the sun and this beautiful territory, the peoples who have been here traditionally and all those who have come after. It's a pretty intimidating crowd, so it's a real honor and privilege to be on the panel and in the room. So I'm going to try to speak a little bit about racism, and I'm happy that my colleagues have already raised the issue. It's something that we don't always talk about so much overtly in Canada. I usually try to start with a place slide. So does anybody know where this march happened? So it was in Ottawa, and it was the march that was held just before the release of the final recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, so just coming on a year ago. So I wasn't there. Was anybody there? Yeah, one person, maybe. It was a really good day for Indigenous and allied people to come together and honor the courage of the tens of thousands of hours of testimony that the survivors of residential school brought to the TRC. So this is the Honorable Murray Sinclair, who's actually been appointed to the Senate now. How many people here have been able to read that summary report? Okay, that's great. So I think it takes about 8 hours. It might be good to have a buddy to read it with. I think that it's really important. You can actually sign up as a witness once you've read it. One of the things that I think challenges us also here in Canada, and I'll get to it in a minute, is I think it's impossible to have been born, educated in Canada and not have huge misinformation about Indigenous people. It's changing a little bit in our school systems now. And then we also do a very poor job of sharing information about Indigenous people with people who have arrived, immigrants and refugees. So this is actually a really good Indigenous 101, which is one of the recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. It's succinctly written. So one of the kind of homework assignments because there's a lot to do, but this is something concretely everybody in this room could do, is to pick a buddy and have a read. So there's 7 calls to action that relate to health. You'll see there's actually 94 recommendations in the Truth and Reconciliation report, I believe, but they're actually called calls to action. So this is also a good thing. And I'm just going to focus on 2 of them because I only have about 10 minutes. But making the links between current Indigenous health disparities and Canadian governmental policies. So the good news is my esteemed colleagues have already done a good job in terms of making these links. And of course, people wouldn't be in this room if you hadn't already made those links. But often we do hear people at an individual level, at a systems level, the blame is actually put on Indigenous peoples. So when Michael Marmot was writing his report on the social determinants of health for the World Health Organization, actually there was an international committee of Indigenous people that got together, and they came up with this idea that everyone agrees there's one critical determinant of health, the effects of colonization. And actually we talk now about Indigenous specific determinants of health, and not only colonization, but also racism, political marginalization. The thing about colonization, though, actually is it's based on attitudinal and systemic racism, right? And there's this connection. So another thing that's interesting is I think sometimes as physicians, it's easier for us to talk about and recognize systemic racism. It's much more painful to talk about our own attitudinal racism. And I learned that when we are working together with the College of Family Physicians, you'll see there's a fact sheet on systemic racism. But in some of the early drafts, there was some very strong allies that were kind of like, well, actually, we can't be attitudinally racist. It's against our professional values. But of course, what we've heard and what we know when we actually look at the evidence, and the evidence could be traditional Indigenous knowledge, the knowledge of many people are going to have varied experiences, right? Because people who are racialized in this room are Indigenous. You don't need to go to the talk, go have a coffee or something like that, right? But so there's a big learning curve in terms of when we're actually carrying a privileged backpack. And of course, even for myself as a Métis woman, there's internalized racism. So the idea was, and again, some of you are better historians than me, nobody thought it was okay to really just come over and claim the land of Indigenous people. So there was this civilizing mission, right? So people actually believed that Indigenous ways of life were inferior, right? And then that we would help them. But then as physicians, when we mostly are trained in biomedicine and we're trying to help someone who's Indigenous, we have to remember that in fact, maybe we are missing something that is valuable, and maybe we could listen and try to understand what that is. So again, because we've already talked about racism, maybe I'll try to go through the next part a little quickly. But one thing that is, I think, different between Canada and the US, and things aren't obviously perfect in the US, but how many people are aware of this unequal treatment report on racism that the Institute of Medicine in the US put out like over a decade ago? Yeah, okay, so some people. But how many people here would have been thinking about racism like as one of the most important determinants of Indigenous health inequities? Yeah, okay, so we got some buy-in already. So this is helpful sometimes because even within my own work at St. Michael's Hospital, people will say she's a fanatic, what's she talking about, this racism? Like there's no racism here. In fact, I saw an email passed on by an Indigenous colleague in a senior policy position from a CEO of a hospital where I'm certain that people are experiencing daily racism, and in fact had heard from healthcare providers they were strategizing on how to manage this. And he was adamant, there's no racism here, right? So anyway, so we know that there is racism, okay? And so I show this Institute of Medicine report, and sometimes these talks, for those of you that already are there, I'm also interested in the strategies. So this is a strategy that I try to use because I have some little badges, I guess, in terms of academic achievement, which is unfortunate because you'll see in a minute that's really a form of epistemic racism and privileging, but I try to get in that door. So what was found by the Institute of Medicine, and what Ritika already mentioned then, is this series of studies that showed that when one looked at race and ethnicity in the funny way that one does in the States, where they talk about people who are white and people who are black and Latino all in, even though one's a ethnic racial category and one's certainly a racialized category. But here's the Todd study that we already heard. Because what happens is people will say, okay, well, maybe there is differential treatment, but it's just because we need more translators, right? Like Aboriginal people aren't understanding. In fact, we need that, right? Or, you know, this one group of people doesn't really like to come for prenatal care. Like they have some special cultural needs, right? But so this long bone fracture study by Todd, I think, is pretty convincing because it's, yeah, sure, maybe there's hugely culturally informed expressions of pain, but people have a long bone fracture pretty well there's no like usually special cultural needs that you don't want to have pain medicine for that. And hopefully most of us, even if there was some culturally specific expressions of pain, could recognize the severe pain that causes. Yet we find that people who are racialized as Black and Hispanic are less likely to get adequate pain medicine. So here's the slide about the different kinds of roots, and of course many of you are aware there's kind of very complex models around the causation of racism. But what I want to focus on here then is at the bottom, the discrimination, biases, and stereotyping, okay? And that happens at the individual level, and then it, we can then have this faulty logic groupthink, and then we can figure out how to challenge that in a group. If you want the long story, here's a report that I had the privilege to work on with a colleague, Dr. Billy Allen, that we released in February of 2015, and it's available online. What was interesting is in 2015, racism made the national news, right? And again, that is a very interesting thing because I'm certain that people who are racialized or Indigenous here in the room, that was no news at all. And also for some allies who have understood and unpacked and made people safe to kind of explore that. So again, we see this evidence emerging. So we've known for about a decade that Indigenous people in Australia and New Zealand, despite having a higher population prevalence, are less likely to get access to life-saving cardiovascular treatments. And again, these all sound kind of invasive, but I find them effective in physician audiences who will be kind of trying to sometimes critically defend in attitudinal or systemic racism, because it makes us really uncomfortable. And even today, I have maybe 5 minutes left, so we're talking about an intellectual level, but those of you that done this work, it's very painful. It has to happen in a slow way, right? We have to feel safe to be able to self-reflect. So that's the real next piece of the homework that we'll get to. But we'll see that in Alberta then, in the last 2 years, we've seen this article in the CMAJ then that showed that First Nations people were less likely to get a coronary angiogram within 24 hours. And those are all controlled for geography. So it's not just Indigenous people live in the north. In fact, the majority of us live in cities now, and the health inequities don't get any better, right? So there are some geography access things. And then here Annette Brown's study in the inner city of Vancouver, where the racism is so pervasive then, people are strategizing before they go to the hospital. Okay, so who here has definitions of racism? Okay, so what we don't get taught is really critical race theory in medical school either. So here's a working definition: avoidable and unfair actions that further disadvantage the disadvantaged or advantage the advantaged. So the two important things here, it's an action, right? So I'm going to talk about bias. Okay, the problem is that our faulty logic and bias that we almost all have as physicians translates into differential action and treatment that we're not even aware of, right? Because I don't think emergency physicians wake up in the morning, or nurses, and say, oh yeah, I want to make all the people who I racialize suffer more from their fractures today, right? So, and then the other thing is here, and we're assuming structured social disadvantage, and I don't think there's much argument there with this group this morning, but it means there can't be reverse racism, there can be reverse discrimination, but there's not reverse racism. So I just tell that to all my colleagues who think I'm a reverse racist. On a good day, I get called that. Okay, so the systemic racism then is when it gets enacted through social systems. So the Indian Act is a really good example of that. Canada's actually been found guilty of systemic racism. Hero Cindy Blackstock found that First Nations children were getting discriminated against in terms of access to appropriate resources for child protection. Actually, when she did that work, there was a lot of information too about health care. And one of the things that she found is that the children were rarely referred to by their names. They were case files. And we actually have a doctoral student doing a health policy analysis of that. So these are some things that we can do at a system level and encourage our colleagues working in federal government departments to always remember the people behind the case files. Okay, and then this attitudinal or interpersonal racism. So I have a hypothesis actually that this is the most dangerous form of racism in healthcare because it's there and we're not acknowledging it in Canada because we're too polite. But the studies show that if we that we all racialize, and if we're in denial and pretending that we don't do it, actually we're more likely to perpetuate differential treatment than we're actually acknowledging it, but then it becomes an uncomfortable conversation. So somehow in Canada we've become all polite and think we're not being racist by pretending we don't racialize, where in fact, as human beings, we're foundationally faulty for whatever reason and we do it. But the thing is we also have heroic leaders and cultures that help us deal with that in a good way. Negative stereotypes and imaging of Aboriginal people. So I think I just have 2 minutes, and there's some really good people on the panel to still hear from. But I just wanted to say the story of this slide is it's actually a CBC slide, and some people might recognize it. It went across Canada, so it was after the confrontations in New Brunswick with Indigenous community members around fracking. What didn't hit the national media as clearly was the images of external police treating Aboriginal elders really poorly. If you want to push a button in many Aboriginal communities, just do something mean to the elders. So here, my auntie came down to Breakfast Cross one day. We were at a meeting, and this was a slide shot for a CBC TV show on cross-racial dental health. So I'm sure they also showed racist slides about the South Asian people or the Black people or the Caucasian people, but this was the one they showed for the Aboriginal kids. So again, it just shows how pervasive these stereotypes and biases. This is a professionally trained media person. They didn't wake up and say, I want to make sure every Aboriginal kid is associated with violence. And then the epistemic racism, which I talked about a little bit, so positioning our knowledge as superior to another group's based on racialization. And again, really most of Western medicine, which isn't really Western medicine, is non-Indigenous. So here's where the book knowledge gets put above traditional Indigenous knowledge. And this is a cartoon actually based on a real land claim in BC, where for the first time an Indigenous elder's knowledge of the land was recognized, traditional Indigenous knowledge of the land. I always just say, and some of you are flying around the north a little bit here, I think I saw Ben Chan. Both of us have shared the privilege of being in a small First Nations community called New Sleep Falls. If our plane crashed and we were in the bush, what would we want? Access to the Cochrane collaboration or access to an Indigenous elder who was knowledgeable. So I'm just gonna, we've already heard again, so from Ritika about this goal about in the Truth and Reconciliation, they actually called it cultural competency training. We're trying to move the language around cultural safety, means that we're actually moving more towards self-reflection, so that the first step is actually acknowledging and understanding that we do have biases. So it takes us beyond the cultural awareness or sensitivity, which actually locate the issue with the person who's framed as the other. Or competence. I say I can barely be competent in my own culture as a Cree Métis woman. How could I be competent in the thousands of sociocultural presentations I get as a physician in Toronto? So just the last 2 slides. The good news is there is something that you can do about it. So studies are actually showing just some common sense things, like spending more time with people, individuating, becoming aware of your own stereotypes and then challenging them. So I say I have Janet Smylie's TTC subway exercise, right? Because I like to look at people and make up stories in my head. So then I start making up a story. I'm pretty classist, right? So I might all of a sudden be feeling sorry for somebody who, from my lens, looks like they are poor. Maybe they're not poor, right? Maybe I can make up another lens, and maybe they are financially poor but don't feel poor, right? I don't think they want my pity. So these last little slides then are some questions that you can ask yourself, and maybe some of you have already, and I think the slides will be shared after, but just making sure you start thinking about where you're getting your information about Indigenous people and maybe learning a little more about it. Thanks very much for your attention.